Welcome to Rogue Bogues, episode 1, My Journey podcast. Thanks for joining. We're going to get right into the family tree from the get-go. So we're going to break down my parents' journey a little bit and my grandparents and all that fun stuff and what led to, obviously, myself and my sister being born. So here we go. Let's get rogue. The family tree starts in Croatia. For those of you who know me, I have a Croatian background. I'm fiercely proud of that. I'm very proud Australian first and foremost, but my background's very, very important to me. We'll explain why later. My mother Ankica Bogut. So we translated that to Anne in Australia for obvious reasons, because it would have sounded like Ankika. A lot of migrants and ethnics from back in the day would change their names, especially from the Balkans with the itches and whatnot, so it could be pronounced properly. Born in a town called Šišović, small village, and by village I mean village. A lot of people that lived in the area, they basically would only do things that were local, generally by foot or where they could get with a bike. To have a car back then was very, very rare. And that's in the town of Karlovac, which is about an hour and a half from the capital, Zagreb. So generally people would live in that area. They're not going into Zagreb. Ever rarely driving down that way. They kind of stay local. And my mother had then migrated with the family, with the grandparents at 11 years old. My grandfather had then divorced my grandmother, left them in Australia, left my grandmother on my mum's side, my mother and her sister, my auntie, and jetted back to Croatia to start a new life, remarried there, had kids there. I'm actually pretty close to what would be classified as my half auntie. Got an half uncle over there as well, but I'm really close to my half auntie and Diana, and she christened our firstborn, her and her husband Alan. So whenever I go back there, I spend a lot of time with them. So yeah, basically my mother was somewhat left to fend for herself without a man in the house. Father had left and was predominantly raised by my grandmother and my great grandmother. Raised my mother, and it was off to reality for her pretty quickly. So that's where that went. My mother worked in admin, secretary, filing, whatever the politically correct term is for that these days. That's what my mother did. Just work for a company and help the boss out. I guess he'd probably classify it as a personal assistant type, just doing the paperwork and all that fun stuff. So that's what my mum did for a living. Yeah, that was it with my mum's journey. It wasn't too deep as far as what my father went through, which we'll get to in a second. But my mother had met my father. They were both in their mid-teens when they met, and they were what would be deemed as high school sweethearts today, and went off and got married and had yours truly and my sister Michelle, obviously before me, 5 years older. So we'll move on to my father, Misha Bogut. Misha, we then changed to Michael because, yeah, there was no chance. It would be Miso, would be the English spelling, like a miso soup. So to avoid bullying and all that kind of stuff, like I said, a lot of ethnic people would change their names and make them a bit more anglicized so they were easier to pronounce. Born in Osijek, Croatia, 3.5 hour drive from the capital of Zagreb. It's actually inland, Hungarian border down that way. Slavonija region, which is known for farming and pastures and flat. It's a flat part of Croatia. So he was there till 14 years old. My grandfather had worked on building sites in Germany, so he'd be a fly in, fly out for a lot of the time, just try and find the odd job. My father had then migrated at 14 years old with his parents, my grandparents, and come to Australia. And it was a time for both my mother and father that you essentially had to be very careful of saying that you were Croatian whilst living in Croatia, which wasn't really called Croatia at the time. It was Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia that we know now, communist regime. And it was they did not take lightly if you were saying that you were Croatian. And there was turmoil basically since World War II there. There were good years and bad years, but like most communist nations, it gets out of hand through portions of time, and the people are usually the ones that suffer. And in this part of the world, in Croatia, it was the Croatians generally, and Bosnia copped it a fair bit as well. But it was to the extent of if you're drinking at a pub or whatever, or you're at home, and the neighbour hears you say something pro-Croatian, they're calling the Yugoslavian, essentially the federal police, the military police, and they're rocking up to your house and kicking the shit out of you and making sure that you're not going to be pro-Croat anymore. And sometimes they'd throw you in jail. My great-grandfather basically got severely, to the point of his life, got beaten in front of the family in Croatia. And that's what it was. It was, you had to be very, very careful what you did and said. And so much so that it carried on to Australia. It carried on to Croatians in Australia, and a lot of people that are Croatian that are listening to this that are around my age or even much older. The Croatian community clubs all over Australia. So most ethnic communities have their own community clubs. So you'll see these random halls with flags, especially in Melbourne. And there were places that we'd go. There was a church there, and then functions would be had there. So Mother's Day, Easter, Christmas, New Year's, there'd be concerts there. Croatian singers would come in from Croatia, all Croatian food, and just tables, and there was a dance floor in the middle. And that was kind of where most Croatian people went. Well, what was happening was there was Yugoslavian spies that got sent out to go to these community clubs and take photos of people in there. And what they would do is they'll take those photos back to Yugoslavia. And the moment those people, that were photographed in basically Croatian community clubs were deemed as pro-Croat and anti-Yugoslav government or anti-government, you'd land back for a holiday and get arrested. And that was happening more often than not. And a lot of people couldn't figure out what the hell was going on when how they knew and all that kind of stuff. And then they figured out that people, there were spies essentially coming to those dances because they can still speak the language. They can look Croatian. They can sound Croatian, even if they're Yugoslavian or different nationalities. And that was kind of how far the hand of Yugoslavia and communism was. It went around the world. So much so that it was, I remember going to dances and there'd be a bloke taking photos of I don't know, his kids or the function itself, and he'd almost, get beaten to a pulp or close to because people thought he was a spy. I mean, that's how crazy it was back in those days. But nevertheless, moving on, I mean, so my father then migrated at 14. They then went back to Croatia at about 16 and a half, for about 6 months to try and make it work. And then they realized how lucky they were in Australia and a very young and free and prosperous country back then. And they really appreciated that. They ended up coming back pretty much straight away. And this was on the ships back in the day. My father still remembers, it's a 5-6 month journey from start to finish, essentially, or somewhere around that timeline to get to Australia. So they, funnily enough, pick for his high school when he was 14, they pick an area called Dufton, which is near where I grew up, funnily enough, near Endeavour Hills and Dandenong. And it's a tough area. It's a rough area. And it's a very Anglo area, very, very, I would say it's yobbo at times. And that's just what it was back in the day. I think it's changed a lot since then, but kind of a cheaper entry point area. And they seemed to school there to Dufton Tech. And so my dad, he's 6'4", big guy, big, strong, burly, bulky guy. Didn't speak much English, obviously stood out like dog's balls because he looked heavily ethnic, probably not the right place to be. So he was bullied from day dot in school, mainly with the WOG taunt, a lot of racism daily. Fucking WOG, go back to where you came from. You don't belong here, and it seemed like he could do nothing right because of that. And it just happened on a daily basis. And this is, the word WOG, I think today has been dumbed down. WOG's out of work, WOG boy, the comedy routine, which I'm a big fan of all the stereotypes of WOGs is absolutely hilarious. And I have no issue with the word today, to be honest with you. Like, there's no word that you can really call me that I really care too much. I'll have a crack back at you and call you a name if you call me a name. I'm kind of that petty, but I'm not gonna try to fight you over a word, or I'm not gonna try and get you fired from your job or get you cancelled just because you called me a name. Should it be used? Probably not, but it doesn't bother me. But you got to remember, in the 70s and 80s, the context of that word was much more fierce. It was laced with venom. And it was all about, mate, go back to where you came from. We don't want you here. You don't belong here. And, for a 14-year-old kid, I mean, half the time he couldn't even understand what they were saying, but he quickly figured out that WOG was not a good thing. And that was something he had to deal with. So my grandmother, a very, very tough lady, still alive to this day, Zdenka, from my father's side. I guarantee you she'll be listening to this podcast. My grandmother has collected every bit of memorabilia she can since I went to college. Really, she'd print out all the stat sheets from every game I played in, print out articles as soon as she figured out how to use the internet and all that kind of stuff, would Photoshop stuff. And I probably have 20 odd folders that she'd made over the years of my career. So it's pretty cool. We'll go through that one day with the kids, her great grandkids, and it's pretty special. And I know she'll be listening to this podcast. So quick shout out to Zdenka. But my dad was getting bullied and went and had a cry to Zdenka, his mother, and I guess there was a group of kids bullying him, and my grandmother had said, well, there's not much I can do about it, but take this with you, and gave him a brick, put a brick in his hand. So he's gone off to school, and my grandfather, like, had a conversation with him as well and said, well, how many in the group are bullying you? And he said, oh, there's one main guy in the group, but there's a bunch of them. Like, what am I supposed to do? And he said, wait or find the guy when he's by himself and give it to him. And that's what he did. He waited for that kid that was in a group of 10 people that would bully him, and he waited for him outside the toilets one day and gave him a beating. And he never got bullied by that kid or that group ever again. But there was one other kid, he said, that was kind of relentless, and he could never really catch him, and he got the wog stuff every day. And so one day in PE class, the kid, I don't know, they were playing something, and my dad obviously messed up, not knowing the sport or whatever it was, and so, you fucking wog, man, what are you doing? This, that. And so my dad, I guess, had enough at that point, and walked up and knocked his lights out, dropped the kid, floored him. Had then the teacher, PE teacher, was behind my dad, walking up to him, kind of to his back, and went on the attack straight away, gave him the, you fucking wog, what do you think you're doing? We don't do that here, all that kind of stuff. And before he even got to kind of grab my dad had elbowed him in the face. And my dad tells me that he just turned around. The PE teacher was on the ground. There was teeth that were on the ground in front of him, and he was crying like a baby. And he then turned around, and the students were about to go my dad, all of them. And he picked up a cricket bat and was ready to start swinging. And somehow it all kind of calmed, and he got sent to the principal's office. So what you would hope or think would be some sort of calm, but guess what happened? You know, the principal gave him the same tongue lashing that he just heard from the previous two people. And, you know, you fucking wog, like, what are you doing? We gave you a chance here, you know, came from another country, blah, blah, blah. And that's all my dad needed to hear. Went over to the desk and grabbed him by the tie and punched him square in the face, and got his marching orders, was expelled in year 8. So think about that, year 8, expelled, gone. And they called my grandmother and said, you know, your son's not welcome back to school. Grandfather had said, well, son, you know, you want to fight and you want to be tough and you want to do all that stuff at school, go find yourself a job if you're an adult. And my father was basically then an adult at 14 years old. So he then tells me that he went on to work, just your general factory work, a labor hand at different businesses. And he said the craziest thing he remembers was how prosperous Australia was. He had 28 jobs in a year. And he said that he would go and get a job by walking into a building and saying, do you need some help? I need a job. They'd give him a job. And there was so much work around that if he hated that job or didn't like it or didn't like the boss, or there were people there that he didn't get along with, he would walk out at lunchtime and just not go back. And he tells me he'd just walk out at lunch, go 3 doors down and go to some other business and be like, hey, I need a job. And he'd get it. And he said it was unbelievable how much work there was in Australia. Just a little tidbit for how Australia once was, I guess, back in the day. And he then nailed down a more solid job, doing the same kind of thing, and long hour shifts, 8-hour shifts there were back then, with no real breaks, wasn't unionized and all that stuff that we see today. So real man's or woman's hard work, you know, 8 hours straight, you know, no breaks, go home, punch the clock and get your money, and hard day's work. And so he then had saved up for a nice muscle car. He was a rev head back then. He'd do all his own cars up, and that's how he ended up becoming a carburetor specialist, still one of the best there ever was, in my opinion. You know, a lot of people with hotted up cars would come across town to see my dad to do their carburetors. So he started doing that, working at a place called Muller's, which then turned into Muller's and Jackers. So I think Ultra Tune, Americans think Jiffy Lube, but a chain mechanic. So he would be the carburetor and fuel specialist. So he'd do all the carburetors. And then he moved up quick, and the boss basically said to him, you know, you're too advanced for an apprentice position. You're way too advanced, and you can go get a real job. So at 17, 18, he did. Went and got a job at a mechanical workshop as the head guy for carburetors and carburetor and fuel specialist. In the meantime, he ran into a bit of trouble with the law. He had a hotted up car and he hung it around a corner, being a hero, and collected a bunch of parked cars. So got arrested. He was 17 years old at the time. Got arrested, had a court date. So they delayed the court date a couple of times, and he was like, cool, probably get off. Like, you know, it's getting delayed. It should be good. But they delayed it enough that he turned 18 when he got prosecuted and ended up getting jail time. Didn't hurt anyone. No one was hurt. It just did some property damage of some parked cars, I believe. And I went to Pentridge Jail in Coburg, which is, I guess now it's a housing development or something, but it was a pretty rough place back in the day. I think my father mentioned that Chopper Reed was around there at that time in a different section or division of the jail, but remembers there was murmurs. But he ended up there for 5 days. So you look at where society's gone today. You'd reckless driving, you'd probably cop a fine, you lose your license, they'd probably impound your car, and you're going home to sleep in your bed. So times have really changed. But the one thing that it did to my father was that he still talked about it throughout my childhood. Like, I never wanted to go back to jail. I absolutely hated it. It worked me up. And I wouldn't say, what he did was absolutely criminal, like hurting someone or robbing someone or willfully trying to do something. He made a mistake and he took it on the chin, faced the consequences, and never wanted to go back there. And he never had issue with the law beyond that. And yeah, just really interesting to hear, how much different it was back in the day, like going to jail essentially for an issue with your car or having an accident or whatever, even though he caused it, but pretty crazy. So you move on to that. He's then working for a guy for a couple of months and then ends up going out on his own. So he goes out and starts his own business at, I think he said he was in his 20s, 20 and a half, 21 years old. So think about that. He's gone from getting expelled from high school in year 8, working factories, not knowing English well. Like, his English was, I don't know if it'd be at primary school level once he'd left year 8. So reading and writing was definitely not a strength. I don't know if it was even past as literate. And now he's starting his own business. So, he ends up starting a place called Miles Carburetors in Seaford with our cousin, who also migrated from Croatia, then moves on to a place called Ace Carburetors, bought an existing business and then turned it into his own, which was in Clayton, which is a very important part of my journey. Then went on to a place called Intune in Rowville. And then the final business was ABC Carburetors, which he did from home for a bit. Then went to a factory in Dandenong and then came back home a little bit more. But those warehouses were my life. That's where I spent a lot of my childhood. I had to go, especially school holidays, especially at a young age before I was in kindy or school, had to kind of go with old man and old lady and watch them work and just hang around in there and just try to play essentially in the factory or the warehouse. And it's just, that whole story for me, for someone that's migrated to Australia, it's the quintessential Australian story of what Australia did for migrants and how much it helped them if they wanted to be helped, and how much work they had and the opportunities they had if they wanted them and wanted to work hard. And my dad's a prime example of that. Like, to go from, like I said, not knowing English well, and the journey that he had, obviously some tough times, to then running a pretty successful business from scratch is pretty impressive. So my mum ended up then working for my dad once he started his own business. So basically, the way carburetors work, my mother would drive out to, say, an Ultra Tune. They'd call, we've got a carburetor problem for a customer. They wouldn't know how to do them. Call my dad's business. He'd be the third party or the subby that would do the job. Mum would drive down Ultra Tune. They'd strip the carburetor. She'd bring it back to my father. He'd recondition it, clean it all up, make sure it's functioning, make it look brand new. Mum would then drive it back to Ultra Tune. That's how we'd make our money. So the marriage of my mum and dad sure was interesting at times. Whenever you work with your spouse, it definitely, there's positives and negatives, and being around each other 24/7, I guess they had good times and bad times, but it was highly stressful at times. I still remember the recession, I think in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s or somewhere around there, and struggling to put food on the table. It was bread for dinner, and I still remember how stressed my dad was, and mum and dad would argue a little bit because I was so stressed, and you don't really know what's going on as a kid, but looking back, asking questions, and it was, the recession, like we had overdraft in the bank and really struggling, but they pushed through and raised the family of 4, and we ended up then, obviously we grew up in Dandenong, my sister and I. My sister Michelle was 5 years older than me, so I was born after her, and we grew up on Brady Road in Dandenong, born in the Mulgrave Hospital. That's kind of where I was till 2 or 3 years old. And then there was a pop-up suburb next door called Endeavour Hills, which lives up to its name. It's full of hills. So an absolute nightmare of a place when you're a kid if you need to walk somewhere or ride a bike, because one way is pretty easy and then the other way is not, or vice versa. Like, it's a pain in the ass. It definitely gave you a lot of exercise. The other interesting thing about Endeavour Hills is all the streets are named after famous explorers. So you got James Cook Drive, you got John Faulkner Drive, you got Singleton Drive, and I guess in today's society, I'm surprised this whole suburb hasn't just been cancelled and there hasn't been pop-up protesters demanding street name changes, but that's a story for another day. It was just an interesting tidbit for that suburb. So I grew up on a street called Sienna Crescent. It was a really steep hill, and that's kind of where the bulk of my childhood was spent, there in Dandenong. And it was a brand new suburb. There was mainly migrants moving to the area because it was an affordable suburb, about 40 minutes from the city. A lot of different cultures, and it was awesome in that sense. I tried all kinds of different food from neighbors, learned different languages. Of course, as a kid, you generally learn all the swear words first from different languages, so I can swear pretty fluently in 2 handfuls of languages, mainly from Europe. So that was always fun. And I think that was a good thing about the area. There was just a lot of different cultures and it was very multicultural. There wasn't a whole lot of one or another. It was a real melting pot. So look, as a kid, Dandenong for me was my city. That was my CBD. We never, ever went to the city of Melbourne. I mean, number one, we couldn't afford just the fuel to drive there and back, but we just wouldn't go there. So Dandenong was the big lights for me. It was like, well, we're going to Dandenong. Like, you know, we're going to the movies. I still remember going to the Dandenong Plaza was like a huge treat, going to the village cinemas down there. So Dandenong was it for me. We spent a lot of time there on the weekends and all our shopping and all that kind of stuff was done there. Wasn't a kid that really went to sporting events, never really had the opportunity. I mean, we didn't, like I said, especially early in my childhood, Dad worked, 9 till 9 some days Saturdays as well, and worked a lot of hours, and they generally would, especially early in my childhood, have to rest up for work, and we weren't going to sporting events at night, and it just wasn't something that we did. We couldn't afford it. It was very, very expensive, even to the footy and whatnot. I think my first footy game as a kid was at 12 or 13 years old with a friend of mine at Waverley Park. We got some free tickets and went. Other than that, it just wasn't something that we did, mainly because of money. So it was just one of those things. So for me, this is then when the Croatian part of me kind of was big, because people kind of find this strange to say. I grew up in Australia, but I grew up in a Croatian household. So I feel like I grew up in a Croatian hub bubble thing in Australia. And the reason I say that is it was Croatian food. My mum cooked Croatian. Our grandparents cooked Croatian. That was the first language that I learned. Babysitters were generally grandparents. They just spoke Croatian. I still remember all the knickknacks around the house were Croatian flags and Croatian clocks and Croatian glassware for the rakia, which is a Croatian spirit, like all that kind of stuff. And I assume most people that listen to this have exactly the same stories. And that was, it was a bubble. It was like a different world from the place I was living out, outside the rest of Australia. But I think we still did a pretty good job of assimilating with Australia and Australian culture and learning the ideals and norms of Australia, and very compatible with Croatia, to be honest. I mean, at that time it was similar ideals and religions and mentality, and Croatians are a bit more crazy and the fuse is much shorter, but they can have a laugh and you can have a punch up and then have a drink an hour later, and that's kind of the similarities. But why do I say that? I think it's very important that migrants, when they migrate, have their own community that they can help them integrate and not have that homesickness and just feel a bit of normality while they're transitioning. But I still feel like you still need to assimilate with regular society, because you need to get a job, you need to learn the language, you need to do everyday things. So I think it needs to be a good 50-50 balance, where I think now you don't want to sway it one way or the other. I think there are some cultures and people that generally move to Australia or America, and they just try to stay in their little bubble. And I don't think it's good. I think it's you need to assimilate a little bit just to give your kids a better chance and their kids, to get better jobs, get out there in the workforce. But that's the path some people choose. And on the flip side, you can't migrate to Australia and completely turn your back on your background or the country that you've fled, which I've seen people do as well, because that homesickness and that mental toll it takes on you will also have an effect. So I think you need a good balance there, in my opinion, and that worked for us really, really well. We really had that balance, and I think my father owning his own business really accelerated that and sped it up. But then, like you have my grandmother on my mother's side, very thick accent still, been in Australia for, 50, 60 years, and generally only assimilated with the Melbourne Knights Soccer Club, community club on that side of town. And all they spoke was Croatian. So English never really got to a level that was really good, because my grandmother just stayed insular within her own Croatian community. So everyone does it differently, but for in my opinion, I think it's vital to integrate into the place you move into, but also keep your ideals. So that was the balance that we had, and that's kind of the way that went. So primary school for me, I went to a school called Thomas Mitchell Primary School, which was just down the street. It was about a 10-minute walk from my house. It was pretty much a brand new school, so it was pretty nice. Like I really enjoyed my time there. As a kid, I was full of beans, energy, very hypo. Funnily enough, both of our kids are very similar. I still remember my parents, just sit down, sit still. I just couldn't sit still, could not sit still for the life of me. And I think a lot of kids like that. I think it's just the energy you have. And I was very, very active. So all about sport, getting out, running, doing this, doing that. And I think by today's standards, if I was in school, I would have been labeled as ADHD or ADD. Today we're quick to label kids, but I definitely didn't have ADD or ADHD, but I would have been labeled with it today. But back then, I think you put a kid in a classroom and put him behind a desk and sit there for 3 or 4 hours, and you have your odd lunch break and little break. I just don't think every kid's going to be good at that, and I wasn't. I couldn't sit still, so I would just wait to go to lunchtime and play and run around and do all those fun things. So very, very active, and yeah, like it's just interesting looking back. Like I said today, it'd be a whole different story, but you'd probably have teachers or parents wanted to medicate you, and I look at some kids today that really don't have major issues besides the fact that they're active and hyperactive and love to run and be free and go and do different things. And that was me. And unfortunately today that's somewhat frowned upon in some schools. I think it's starting to change a little bit and we're a bit more aware of it. But I know in America there's a huge issue with kids. I think the spike for ADHD and ADD, I think it's at an all-time high with Adderall and all that kind of stuff. So pretty sad times, but just an observation from my childhood. And primary school for me, look, I had a fair few dramas, I had a fair few fights as a young kid. I still remember them to this day. A few notable ones. One was the kid playing basketball had said something to me, and said something offensive to me. So I turned, pushed him, he fell over, and didn't push him that hard, pushed him enough, but he fell over and was kind of quite embarrassed by it. And I did the noble thing, which is rare for me, and I turned around and tried to walk away, and he kicked me in the back of the leg as he was on the floor. And I saw right after that, I turned around and unfortunately booted him in the face. And the damage I could have done, which I didn't, thankfully, but he was balling and gave him a pretty good one, and that was a pretty quick wake up call for me of dealing with consequences. Got in a fair bit of trouble, but I was always taught to defend myself, but probably should have let that one go. That was one. And then the second one, which caused me a lot of problems for kind of the rest of my adolescence and teen years, was I was in grade 3 or 4, and my best mate and a guy named Marco, a Croatian kid that lived up the street. And he was, a bit of a troublemaker. If he's listening to this, I say hello. But us together was a bad mix. We were a troublesome pair. And we used to go to school on weekends, like go to the school when it was closed. And that's how stupid we were as kids. Like we didn't really like school. We hated school, and couldn't wait for the weekend to come. And then on the weekend, we get our footy, our bike and our ball and go to school and ride around the school and play on the playground and play on the footy fields and whatever. So I'm there one weekend and in grade 3 or 4, and there's a kid that's in grade 5 or 6, he was 2 or 3 years above me. Still remember his name. His name was Waleed, or Wally for short. And we got into a little tussle about something, and he squared up to me, and I just remember booting him straight in the nuts. He went down like a sack of shit, and we got out of there, my friend and I didn't know how much of a problem that would cause me for the rest of my short adolescence and teenage years. So this kid ends up being one of those gang type thugs that would be hanging out at the shops and would stare you down and what are you looking at type blokes and want to go me, one of those guys. He ended up turning into one of those guys. So when I was in high school, he used to get his mates, and one of them had their P plates, and he'd hang with the older crowd. He dropped out of high school in year 9, I think it was. And yeah, they would come out and wait for me. I went to St. John's Regional College in Dandenong Catholic School. I used to catch a bus there. They used to come away from me. So I'd find out through other friends, like, this guy's here waiting for you. So I'd have to navigate different exits sometimes. They never caught me, thankfully. It's close a few times, but I'd always try to play it smart, and I always had my head on a swivel, especially, the Endeavour Hills to Dandenong bus route is something that I could write a book on alone, of all the shit that I saw on that bus and people high on drugs and all that kind of stuff, or all kinds of people. And yeah, I mean, Wally thankfully never caught me. So if you're watching this, unlucky mate, but that was interesting. So going back to my best mate, Marco, yeah, we hung out nonstop. We both were from families that migrated from Croatia. So just naturally got along. He lived a 1-minute walk from my house, just up the street, and we do all kinds of stuff together, play sport together. He was pretty sporty as well. He was more soccer, but we played cricket. We do everything together. And we then started, the Endeavour Hills Shopping Centre just got built. It was a brand new shopping complex. It was about a 20-minute walk from our house. And if anyone's listening to this that owned a business there or the shops there, I apologize, because the shit that we used to do at that place and just getting in trouble nonstop and just being absolute young shitheads. We're only 10, 11, 12 years old, but we used to go there on weekends, and that would generally be our hangout spot, other than schools, really. So, if it was really hot, we'd go there because it was air conditioned. If it was raining, we'd go there because there was a roof over our head. And we would Jackass the movie before Jackass the movie came out. So what do I mean by that? We'd go to Big W, we'd take the Nerf guns out of the boxes and run around the store shooting each other. We'd get footies and kick them over the shelves to each other in the middle of the store. We'd play basketball on the hoop set up. Like, we'd just do so much stupid, reckless stuff and just just being a nuisance, really, just dumb kids that needed a clip around the ear. And then we'd go to, Safeway, it was called Safeway at the time, which is now Woolworths. And we'd go in there and go to the fruit section and have a banana and eat some nuts as we walk around the store, have a chocolate bar and a can of Coke, and then walk out. And, probably owe Woolworths some money along the way, but it was just what we did. We were kids that never really had money in our pockets, and it's not an excuse. Obviously, once we grow up and be an adult, you look back and realize how silly it was, but they're the kind of things we did. We'd play pranks on people, and we'd have water pistols, and we'd walk around shooting people with the water pistols kind of under our arms, waiting just random people, like just stuff like that. Just absolute. I think Jackass, a movie, probably not to the extremes that they took it, but we were that at 11 or 12 years old and doing it at the shopping centre. So it got to a point where my mate ended up getting banned from Big W. We got run-ins all the time. So that was kind of where we had our fun. And one of my other mates was a Macedonian kid. He owned the local milk bar, so we used to go and hang out at the milk bar. We used to, I still remember when it was 40 degree days back in the day, and used to go to the milk bar and hang in the fridges, like, in the actual back part of the fridges, just sitting there. And they were the fun things we kind of did, to just pass time. But like I said, we couldn't do it too much because our families didn't have a lot of money and we didn't have a lot of money in our pockets. So we made do with what we had. We did all the other fun stuff like putting dog poo in a paper bag and lighting it on fire and knocking on people's doors. We, all that dumb stuff. We got our own houses egged. We egged other people's house. It was just things you did as a kid, and people that are my age can probably relate a little bit better. But they were just things that we did. When you talk about it now, you realize how stupid you were. But the other part of childhood for me was, I guess, the business mentality that at least myself and Marco had at a young age. It was, we'd try to find any way we could just to get $1 in our pocket. And when we did, we'd end up spending it on stupid stuff anyway, mainly basketball cards. I still remember we'd get like a bucket from home, fill it up with soap, sponge, and go door knocking. Hey, can we wash your car for $5? People would do it. People would be like, cool, yeah, go for it. And I probably should charge more thinking back, but then we get $5 and we go do something with it. We go buy some basketball cards or some lollies or something silly that kids buy. I remember in Australia, in primary school, they'd had these chocolate drives for those of you who went to school in Australia, and you get a case of chocolate bars, I think Toblerone looking chocolate bars, those long kind of bars, and you get about 24 pack, and you'd have to go home and then sell them to friends or family, or you could go door knocking, or you could do whatever you wanted to do, and you'd sell them to raise money. And then if you sold them quick enough, I think you had 6 weeks to sell them. If you sold them quick enough, some kids would get a second box, and then there was like a competition about who could sell the most chocolates, and it was usually kids that had money. Their parents would end up buying them all or whatever. But I figured out a good way to make money out of that was, the chocolates were $2. There'd be a slip in with your chocolates that kind of you're supposed to show people, like, hey, this is what we're raising money for. Like, here's all the details. This is how much it is. I took that straight out, and the $2 was now $4 because I wanted a commission for doing the hard labor of selling these chocolate bars. So I like to think that was pretty business orientated for the future. So I'm involved heavily right now in a bunch of different things from a business point of view. And I guess that's where it came from. The only other thing I remember we did, used to go to the Melbourne Knights soccer games up out in Sunshine. I went like 2 or 3 times with Marco, his family. They drove us out there, but I'd never really been. I think it was Marco Viduka's last year, I think. And we'd go out there, and the NSL, National Soccer League, I think back then they had these kind of soccer newspaper things that would come out monthly, and they were free. Like, and if you enter the game, paid your admission fee, you get a free newspaper. So we go to the bathroom, and there's like 2 crates of newspapers tied up in like a zip tie type thing, just sitting there in the front of the bathroom as you walk in. So me and Marco end up taking the newspapers, putting them in a bag, and walking around like in the crowd during the game live and selling them for $1 a pop. So we ended up selling a bunch of them until some bloke like looked at the front of it, and it actually had free on the front of the newspaper. So I just remember shit like that, and all these old men are like, abusing us in Croatian. But that's the kind of stuff we did as kids. I mean, I'm sure there's an endless amount of stories that people out there have from childhood, and just reliving those is so cool to hear some of those stories. Some of them are crazy, some of them are not. But that was kind of, what we did as kids, and it just, it was fun back then. And sometimes we deserved to get a hiding from it. Sometimes we didn't. And you learnt a lot, especially growing up in Dandenong. For me, in that area, I learned to have my head on a swivel at an early age, because it meant a junkie knocking your block off. It meant someone stealing, your bag. It meant you just had to have a head on your swivel. And catching buses and trains and public transport. And, as a young fella, and you had to figure it out. There were places even in my high school, there were places that I knew not to go during lunchtime. I knew places in Dandenong when I'm going to the bus stop. I'm like, I don't want to go down this way because I know there's some boys that hang there that are a bit rougher that might go, might try to roll you, or I don't know, take your bag or whatever you got. So it was one of those suburbs that highly stressful at times, but I think it was invaluable to who I am today, because it made me really appreciate everything that I have now. But at the same time, it kind of helped me kind of vet people better. I think I got a good feel for knowing if someone's a good person and what's going on here, and am I getting ripped off by this or that. I think that journey throughout my childhood helped me to that, because Dandenong was a place that if you wanted to look for something silly, you'd get ripped off, and that was just the way it went. And that really helped me for later on in life. So then moving on to home life, it was really interesting for me growing up, because my dad was a very hard worker, and the mentality for him was, if I'm working, you're working. And I figured out at a really young age, even before I started playing basketball, on the weekends, get the hell out of the house as quickly as you can. You wake up Saturday morning, have your breakfast, and get out of there. And the reason why I say that is my dad worked hard all week. He worked sometimes even Saturday mornings. But let's say it was Sunday morning and you sleep in as a kid or whatever, and you had a long week of school, and watching cartoons in the morning, eat breakfast, mum's made you some toast, and the old man's already mowed all the lawns, he's whippersnippered, he's fixing stuff around the house. God forbid he came in for a coffee or a drink or a bite, and you're lying on the couch doing nothing, feet up, loving life right now, relaxing, watching TV. You would get the, hey, what are you doing? Nothing. You bored, huh? Okay, come with me. And then it was, you're helping him clean up the trimmings off the grass. You're sweeping the yard. I mean, whatever it is. And I just knew that if I'm hanging around doing nothing, it's going to piss him off. I'm getting out of there. I'm taking a footy, a basketball, soccer ball, going to the local sports fields and staying out as long as I could on weekends. And that was, it was what it was. And I still remember a mate of mine. I think it's more a Balkan Croatian mentality as well. It's you work and you work and you work harder. And a mate of mine, we were at his house one day, and we chucked a couple of eggs at his neighbor, stupidly enough, at his neighbor's house. His old lady found out about it and was fuming. Daniel got grounded for a year. 1 year grounded, man. Like, it was, he's probably listening to this as well. So shout out to Daniel. But I still remember, like, we used to catch a bus after school and go to the shops and hang out a little bit and then catch the next bus home. He wasn't even allowed to do that. Like, his mum was like, no, you need to be home at this time. And she would make sure she was there. So he got grounded. So his mum used to make him vacuum the house once a week. He still told me this story that she'd come home and he had vacuumed, but not properly. And the old lady goes, have you vacuumed yet? He goes, yeah, I haven't. He goes, no, you haven't done it properly. Like, there's still stuff everywhere. And he gave her the old, well, if you don't like the way I do it yourself. If you want it done the way you want it done, I won't do it then. And she said, oh, okay, cool, I gotcha. Walked away, went and grabbed the vacuum cleaner, came up to him and said, follow me. And she made him watch her vacuum the whole house. And he said it was like an hour or whatever it was, like purposely going slow. And he had to watch the whole time and just kind of shadow her throughout the house. And then she finished, looked at him and said, you think you got the hang of it? We need to do it again. And he's like, no, I'm good. And then we'd have to vacuum the house. And my dad was exactly the same. Like, it was, you would never use that excuse. If you got you to do something, you didn't do it properly. Like, you were hearing about it and you were doing it again. And so my dad actually started getting smart. He knew that I was just trying to bail out of the house on weekends. So we had two old Toyota Corollas, like 80s Toyota Corollas, and we had a Ford Fairlane, both, nice cars for us, but they weren't expensive cars or anything. But he would then give me the old, I need you to vacuum, wash and vacuum those three cars before you go do what you want to do on the weekend. And I was like, man, you can't be serious. Like, it's going to take me 3 or 4 hours. So yeah, well, the sooner you get started, the sooner you can go do what you want. So I would do that. And then he would come and inspect the cars and there'd be a rim with a bit of dirt on it. I have to redo the rim. Like, and it was, I just knew, like, do this properly or he's going to rail me for it. So I tried to do it the best I could, but that was a mentality we had. It was, there's no excuse for doing something half-assed. If you're going to do something, do it properly, or you're going to do it again. And that was kind of the way it went. And that factored into the going to work with my dad, whenever I'd have to go to work or school holidays or whatnot, he'd be working and I'd be running around riding my bike and doing this and doing that. But there'd come a time, every time I went with him, that he'd be like, hey, go get the broom and sweep up this. Go get the vacuum cleaner and vacuum my workbench for me. Vacuum up all the dust, all the droppings or whatever. And that was just... That was what it was, and you hated it at the time, but it instilled some effort for reward. Now, for the cars, he would pay me most times. He'd give me, $10 or $20 pocket money to go do what I wanted with. But there were some times if he was pissed at me, like I'd wash the cars and thought I was getting pocket money and wouldn't get them. And it was interesting. Like I'd saved up my own money to buy my own TV, and I thought I was balling. I put my own TV in my room so I could go up and watch TV. I actually saved up for a VCR as well, which is big time because I used to record NBL and NBL games and then watch them. So whenever shit at the fan, my parents, I'd go to my room and watch TV, right? So, if I pissed my dad off, he'd walk straight into my room, he'd rip the TV cord out of the wall and take the TV and pinch the TV and be like, you're losing your TV. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I paid for my TV. Like, why are you taking my TV? He goes, I pay for the electricity. So once you pay for that, you can get your TV back. And I was like, you just can't win, man. So like, you take that for a month or two and then, I'd eventually do something good and I'd get it back. But that was just the reality of growing up in a household where your parents were hardworking and they tried to instill the same to you. And, he had a rough childhood, obviously, with his father was very hard on him. And like, did I cop beatings every now and then? Sure, I did. I don't condone it. I don't think it was right. But some days that, sometimes they were warranted to get a clip behind the ear. And I guess that was the way my father was treated by his father. If it was worse and he tapered it down and still, when it all came down to it, that was all he knew. And yeah, I was still scared of my dad till I was, 17, 18 years old. And then, once I grew up, started lifting weights, I felt a bit better about myself. But yeah, man, like he was a scary dude. So that's where that went, off the court type stuff. We move on to sport and how I got involved with basketball. First started in gymnastics, funnily enough. So you can laugh at that all you want, but I got grouped in with my sister who was 5 years older. So I chucked in the car with her and thought, oh, well, this is a good idea. We can drop them off at the same spot and it's one less trip, and absolutely hated it. Like, couldn't stand it. Hated going. The only thing I really liked doing was jumping on the trampoline, but not doing like all the flips and just jumping on the trampoline was fun. And that was it. The rings, the balance beam, you can have all that. I don't want all that. I'm good. Stretching and all that calisthenics. No, I'm good, man. So I begged them to quit that. So then they let me start doing some Vic Kick, which is now called Oz Kick, which is your Australian rules football kind of clinic type stuff, and you play a little bit and all that kind of stuff. Love that. But the old lady wasn't a huge fan of it, getting the car all muddy in Melbourne and wet and stinky from the mud. So did that for a little while. Did some Taekwondo as well. Remember doing that and then having our first kind of graded spar where you're just supposed to do the techniques and all that kind of stuff, and was against someone else in the class and doing the techniques, and he clipped me, I think, in the face by half accident and just laid him out and just kicked him straight in the stomach. He went down and, everyone's kind of losing it. Like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. And that was enough Taekwondo for me. I was done after that. And then, basketball came up. So I had always kind of liked basketball. And once my father had Ace carburetors in Clayton through the 80s and 90s, the story's been told before by the media that I think the factory's still there. I'm not sure if the hoop's still there, but there was a hoop that the panel beaters directly next door to us. So it was two joint factories, 1A and 1B. The separation wall outside, they drilled a Kmart type hoop into that wall. So the two bolts rim straight in the wall. They use it to hang things up to dry. So they'd spray paint little parts or whatever from a car, and they have these massive hooks, metal hooks, and they'd have stuff drying on there. So that was my first hoop. I don't know if it was regulation height. I don't know if it was regulation size, but I started throwing a tennis ball, then a soccer ball, then a basketball, and I just fell in love with the game. And it was probably at 7, 8 years old, but never really thought about formally, didn't even know teams existed to play. Like, you're a kid, you don't know any better. So that's where that journey towards falling in love with the game started, and then it turned into seeing it on TV. Hang on a second, this is what I was doing at my dad's shop. Like, this is on TV. This is really cool. So I started watching it. Then I remember I'd tape NBA Game of the Week would be on a Saturday morning. They'd cut a full game into 1 hour. Then NBA Action would follow that, and then there'd be something NBL on a Friday night, and sometimes on a Saturday arvo. I record all of it, and then I'd watch those tapes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday until I got a new tape. I wouldn't tape over it. I'd just continue taping, and then I'd have all these basketball tapes, and then so in the off season I'd start again and watch all those tapes till the next season, so I could record more. And that's how the passion for me me started. Just always had a natural love for it. People out there think, oh, you're 7 foot tall, you're always going to make it in basketball. I didn't know I was going to be 7 foot tall at that age. My dad's 6'4", my mum's 5'10". Like, no one would have guessed I was going to be 7 foot. So I love the game at a young age, and I didn't play it because I was tall. It was the tall thing for me that came later on in life was, a God-given gift and something that I was very lucky with, but I always loved the game. So going from that, it then became, hey, mum, dad, I need a hoop at home. I need to be able to practice. So the old man put a hoop up in the front yard, and we lived on a steep hill, and then our driveway was a steep hill that went down to the garage. So about a 45-degree incline. That's where the hoop was. So think about you're standing on the 45-degree incline facing the hoop. Some spots you're shooting from 15 feet, and some spots are 8 feet, some spots are 10 feet. And if you spray a shot to the right, off the right of the rim, you run down the hill chasing it, dodging cars or whatever. So that was my first hoop, and I loved it. But then it got to a point where you're like, Mum, Dad, can you move the car? I want to go shoot. And then you shoot, and you're like, man, this is like, it's great because I never had a hoop, but can we do a little bit better? So I told the old man, like, oh, can we do something better? So we had a pool in the backyard, one of those above ground fiberglass pools. I'm sure there's people out there that can relate to them. Like you neck yourself just getting in the bloody things, and you got to be real careful not to push off too hard off the sides because the whole thing could collapse. But that's what we had, and we enjoyed it. My sister and I at a young age, and my sister would swim a bit more than me, and then I guess the old man had decided that, all right, we're going to remove the pool. Sister was pissed. We're going to remove the pool, we're going to put a basketball court in the backyard. And it was a pretty big space in that corner. I was like, sensational. Like, this would be awesome. Put a basketball court in the back there, or a little probably quarter or whatever we could fit. And I thought it was the best thing ever. Little did I know, my father had a grand plan. So we had a veggie garden on the side of our house. And it was okay, but he put it in a spot that wasn't getting a lot of sun. So he was starting to get pissed off, and he's like, why can't I grow this? Why can't I grow that? What's going on? This, that. And then obviously did some study. Like, he's one of those guys that'll go back and study things when he can't figure it out and it pisses him off. And I'm very similar. I'll do the same and jump online, even if it's about the dumbest thing ever. I'll try to research it and read about it and figure it out. What he didn't tell me was where the pool was, he's going to put a veggie garden in that area, and in front of it, along the neighbor's fence next door to us, would be a little court. So it ended up being about the width of a free throw line, maybe a little bit more, maybe another foot wider, and the length was about to the free throw line, maybe a bit further back. And then it dropped a little bit after that, and that was it. And it kind of squared up to our veranda area. So I had this little kind of cocoon, right? And we just laid pavers down, and that was it. We concreted in a hoop, and that was where the journey all started for me, as far as having my own little piece of heaven. That to me, that was Kudos Arena, that was Staples Center, that was Oracle Arena, that was Madison Square Garden. Like, I was in my element, right? So the ball starts going over the fence a lot. Like, okay, every so often I got to jump over the fence or go knock on the neighbor's door and have my balls in the backyard. So my dad was like, all right, we'll try to fix that for you. So this dude goes to the local hardware store. He buys some shade mesh and some treated pine posts and puts up this, like on that whole side of the fence where the neighbor's house was, he puts up, it's probably would have been close to 15, it was taller than the hoop, it was 15, 20 feet tall on massive posts. So every time I'd shoot and miss or whatever, the ball would spray off, it would just hit that shade mesh and stay in bounds. So he's just done that. And no permits, all this council approval stuff. Please, they'll be right, don't worry about it. So I know the neighbours weren't happy because it was blocking a bunch of their sun in their backyard. Then that veggie garden in the corner, he's basically built a full-on enclosure. So he's built a veggie garden, and all the birds started pinching all these veggies and stuff that he was growing. So he's then gone on, this is all done by himself. Like, he's very good with his hands, and builds a massive, it looked like a chicken coop, like, chicken wire fencing, chicken wire roofing, chicken wire door. And that was kind of the corner of my basketball heaven, massive wok veggie garden growing, massive cucumbers and all that kind of stuff. So it was pretty funny, but that was kind of where that all started. The next problem we had was Melbourne winters. It gets dark 4:30, 5 o'clock. It's already getting dark, and I want to stay outside and shoot. So he then ended up putting some floodlights up, so I could be out there till 8:30, 9 o'clock. And I'd do that most nights until the old lady would come to the back door and yell at me to come inside. I got school the next day or whatever it was. Or every now and then we had two neighbours. The neighbours on the other side, Romanians, I believe, they'd come out and lose their shit and start yelling at me like to go to bed or go inside. So that was just it. The neighbours, all they heard was balls bouncing nonstop. And that was, to me, I was in my element, man. Like, whether it was 40 degrees outside, whether it was raining, whether it was windy, I'd be outside, doing something basketball-wise. And that was kind of, I guess, also my release from, whether school sucked or you're getting bullied at school or you got in a fight or your parents are, breaking your balls or whatever it is. That was kind of the place I could go and forget about all that. So that's what basketball brought me. That led me to basically begging to sign up for a basketball team or a basketball club. So I went to my parents, hey, I want to play basketball. And yeah, we heard that all before. This all costs money, changing sports left, right, and center. You don't understand uniforms, shoes, fees. Money doesn't grow on trees. That speech that I'd heard, countless amounts of time as a kid, whenever it was anything to do with money. And that's, because we didn't have a lot of it, it was warranted and they had a point. I'd been in 3 different sports in 3 years and, they thought I was in basketball, then what next? And they basically said, look, if you change sports to basketball, this is it. You're not changing anymore. We're not paying fees and uniforms. It costs a lot of money for us. So I was like, cool. I pushed all my chips in the middle of the table and was like, oh, I'm all in for basketball. I'm good. It's what I want to do. And first club I played for was the Endeavour Hills Redbacks. I think it was B, C, D grade. I don't know what it was. It wasn't A grade, and it was just played at the local Endeavour Hills Leisure Centre. And the moment I walked in for my first game, it just clicked. The smell of the wood floor, the whistle, the noise of the whistle, the noise of the squeaky feet, having to come in and watch the game before you, it just felt all so real and awesome. And I don't know, it was something that just clicked naturally for me, like a square peg in a square hole. And I still remember that game to this day. It's a long time ago. I think I was 9 years old or 10 years old, and I scored my first basket. It was a free throw, funnily enough. Go figure. I went 1 for 2 from the line. So much like my career, I went 1 for 2, and I actually made both free throws, but I toe bashed the line, and the referee, probably refs in the NBL now, but yeah, referee, he cancelled the free throw because I toe bashed the line. But I went 1 for 2, and I still remember getting home, and it was Saturday morning. My dad was at work. I called my dad, and I was so pumped. It was like I scored 50. I made a shot, I made a free throw, blah, 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 blah. I'm so it's great, good job, whatever. And you just look back at those days and you think, like, once you're a professional, if you scored 8, 9, 10 points some games, you'd be really disappointed with yourself. If your average was 15 or whatever, you have a bad game, but maybe you have 7 and 7, 7.7 rebounds. You're like, oh man, I wasn't good tonight or whatever. You look back at that kid and it was like, you couldn't tell me anything. I made a shot. I scored my first basket, and that is where the journey to basketball for me started, with the Endeavour Hills Redbacks, the Endeavour Hills Leisure Centre, with a 1 for 2 trip to the free throw line, and the rest will continue on. So I appreciate everyone tuning in to Rogue Bogues. This was episode 1 of the Rogue Bogues, the Journey podcast. So breaking down everything, Andrew Bogut and family and all that kind of fun stuff. So appreciate you all tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe. We're Rogue Bogues on all social media platforms. We're on all good podcast platforms now. We should be everywhere. There's a link in the bio for all the Rogue Bogues websites. It takes you to a page that has basically every platform that our podcast is on. So you can find it there. And episode 2 will follow this, and we'll be digging more into junior basketball and high school and all that fun stuff. So I hope you enjoyed. It's kind of an in-depth, long-winded, kind of 0 to 11 years old part of my life, but some real quirky, interesting stories along the way, and it'll only get better as we go along. So thanks for tuning in, and thank you for getting rogue with us.